If you've hung around the autistic community for a while, regardless of whether you yourself are on the spectrum, you may have noticed there's an unusually large number of autistic folks who are gender diverse. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term gender diverse, that includes people who identify as transgender, as well as gender queer, which also includes terms like non-binary. Studies suggest that at least 15% of folks on the autism spectrum identify as gender diverse, and as much as 1/4 of transgender folks are autistic. Now, given the big overlap between autism and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, would it also surprise you to know that a similar percentage of people with EDS report these same issues? In a recent study by Jones and colleagues, they found that of the 166 EDS teenagers seen at their clinic, 17% of them reported gender-related issues. Now, you may be wondering why there's such a plethora of gender-diverse people on both of these spectrums, and the answer to that is likely a complex one. Actually, it's undoubtedly a complex one, and it's made up of a number of variables. Now, one likely factor coming from a sociological perspective is that autistic and other neurodivergent people tend to be less influenced by societal norms and expectations of all kinds, including gender norms. So we may be more likely to explore and push the boundaries of how we define ourselves and our genders. The other major side is, of course, biology, but the biology is complex. On the one hand, there are undoubtedly numerous genetic factors that play small but measurable roles in helping to determine gender. One study a few years ago by Theisen and colleagues found a small selection of rare genetic variants in transgender people that were associated with pathways in brain development linked with estrogen. But genetics aside, there are other ways that gender can be influenced multi-generationally, but potentially beyond genetics. The endocrine system, aka hormones, is one of the systems of the body that is very plastic, meaning that it can change in response to environmental input. But this can happen very young, prenatally, in fact. Now, in people who are assigned male at birth, or AMAB, they have 3 periods in their lives when there's a surge of androgens, and that's, of course, in puberty, but also during the prenatal period between 8 and 24 weeks of gestation, as well as postnatally during infancy from about 3 to 6 months of age, and they call this a mini puberty. These 2 early androgen surges are important not only in masculinizing the sex organs, but also the brain. On the other hand, people who are assigned female at birth, or AFAB, their sex and gender characteristics are primarily defined by the absence of androgens, although there's also a mini puberty for AFAB people starting in infancy from about 3 months and going to 3 years of age with higher levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, as well as a little bit of estrogen. And that leads to the growth of the ovarian follicles, which are part of the ovaries. Now, this mini puberty is also thought to help train what's known as the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal, or HPG axis, which is really important for regulating reproductive function during adolescence and adulthood, and that goes for both sexes. The hypothalamus in the brain develops differently according to how much or how little testosterone it's exposed to during early development, which can have long-term effects on reproductive-related behaviors. Now, in AFAB people, prenatal exposure in the womb to higher levels of androgens, something called prenatal androgen exposure, or PNA, means they're more prone to having an earlier onset of puberty. Unfortunately, their HPG axis is also less sensitive to estrogen, ultimately leading to even more estrogen production, as well as other hormones like testosterone. Because of this faulty feedback loop, and then that potentially leads to many of the classic symptoms that we see actually associated with polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS. And yes, PCOS occurs at unusually high rates in AFAB people on the autism and EDS spectrums. This also leads to other issues like being prone to insulin resistance and diabetes, as well as increased weight, all of which act like a nasty snowball effect, producing even more estrogen and testosterone thanks to that fat tissue. Now, the irony in this situation is that people who are assigned female at birth who have this dysregulated HPG axis stuff thanks to prenatal androgen exposure are more likely, if they get pregnant, to expose their daughters to higher androgens, leading to a generational cycle. Now, there are a variety of ways this cycle can start. One of those is, of course, a genetic propensity. Another way is maternal stress. Yes, mom being stressed out during pregnancy produces higher than normal androgen levels, and it can affect development of her child's HPG axis. So you may be sitting there thinking, well, that explains autistic AFAB people, but what about people assigned male at birth? They also have higher rates of gender diversity. And I'll say that while we don't know quite as much about how it occurs in AMAB people, one major possibility is that mothers who produce higher androgen levels, whether that's due to their own HPG axis dysregulation, like if they have PCOS, or if they're just under higher stress during pregnancy, that can also produce far more estrogen than a male fetus typically receives. So not only is there potentially more testosterone, there may also be more estrogen, and that may also affect how the HPG axis develops in people assigned male at birth. So we see these multi-generational links with autism, EDS, which I will mention also has a lot of hormone disorders, including PCOS, and then gender diversity. Not only do we see how these hormones influence development of the hypothalamus, an important brain structure that's part of that HPG axis and that ultimately helps regulate reproduction and reproductive behaviors, but these hormones also influence how other parts of the brain develop. In some support of this, there was a study by Beecher and colleagues back in 2012 that found, one, there were fewer notable sex differences between the brains of male and female autistic people compared to the differences that we see between non-autistic people, between the sexes. So in other words, the brains of autistic folks were more similar to each other than you expect according to sex. And two, female Audis had some brain structures similar in size to that of allistic or neurotypical males, while some structures in male Audi brains were more similar to allistic females. So with these data, the researchers suggested that what we're seeing in autism isn't as simple as one might expect with Simon Baron-Cohen's extreme male brain theory. Instead, it's more like what you would expect with our multi-generational prenatal androgen model, where males and females are exposed to higher androgen and estrogen over generations. Now, last but not least, you might be wondering how all this hormone stuff might be linked with or even predisposed towards Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility spectrum disorders. Now, this last part is probably complex because there's a whole bunch of issues we see in relation to conditions like PCOS and prenatal androgen exposure. And so before I dive into that, I just want to state categorically that what follows is strictly theoretical, although it is based off of general knowledge of physiology. Now, with that said, first off, while androgens do increase the synthesis of connective tissue proteins like collagen, which you'd think is a good thing, they also increase its breakdown or turnover. In males with normally high androgen levels, this probably leads to more of an emphasis on enhanced strength of connective tissue. Meanwhile, in PNA women who, although they do have higher androgen levels than non-PNA women, they don't have androgen levels anywhere near what males typically have. This intermediate level may actually disrupt the normal balance of tissue remodeling, leading to a weakened connective tissue. Also remember, though, that PNA women can sometimes have runaway levels of estrogen, too. So although estrogen is generally thought to increase the strength of connective tissue, it also increases the turnover of collagen, which under these circumstances may actually reduce connective tissue strength and increase its elasticity. So anyways, that was a lot of science to throw at you, but just to say that prenatal exposure to different levels of hormones can definitely influence many aspects of a person's behavior and physiology throughout their lives, and it may well play roles in autism and Ehlers-Danlos to boot. Well, I hope you enjoyed this week's dive down the proverbial rabbit hole. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and let me know in the comments whatever questions you might have and what other topics you'd like to learn more about. So until next week, take care and